Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and today we're going to be talking about how we raise over 1,000 garden starts from seed indoors for our subarctic garden every year. We're going to talk about what we use and how we do it. So if this sounds like something interesting to you, you're going to want to come along for the ride. This is part 2 in our Growing from Seed series. In part 1, we covered all the way up to initial germination. So in that video, you learned how we plant seeds and how we get them up to an initial transplant size or plug. And then this video is going to build upon all those concepts and follow the process all the way up until we get a garden transplant that we can put into our garden. In the previous video, we introduced you to our germination kit, and we're going to use some of those pieces, but not others. So we still use our 10-20 trays, and they're really important for us to use for plant mobility and getting our plants around. But we're also going to add what are called 606 jumbo inserts, 3.5-inch pots, and 5.5-inch pots, and those are what we are growing into for larger plant sizes. Like we mentioned, we use 606 jumbo inserts to raise the overwhelming majority of our plants. And these are what you see behind me here. And if you've ever bought a 6-pack from a nursery, you know what an insert is. There's lots of different sizes that are available, but in general, we've found that the 606 jumbo size is a universal size that we can use across all of our plants and help us minimize the amount of complexity and gear that we have to buy and maintain. With 606 inserts, we can fit 36 plants into a single 10-20 tray, and this is generally the highest density that we grow into for raising our plants. We also use 3.5-inch pots, and typically we're going to use these for plants that grow exceptionally fast and large. Examples might include tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and artichokes. And these are really important for us to use for perennials as well, because those like to have minimal transplants and prefer a bit more soil to grow into. With these 3.5-inch pots, we can fit 18 of them into a 10-20 tray, so that's a medium density that we can grow into. And the last pot size that we use are 5.5-inch pots, and these are typically aimed for very late in the season. In cold climates, sometimes our last frost dates can vary quite significantly, and for some of those large and fast-growing plants, we might want to up-pot them into a larger soil size, just in case we have those extended frosts and we need to delay our plantings into our garden. And most years, we do transplant our tomatoes and peppers into these plants, as well as our artichokes. And with the 5.5-inch pots, you can get 8 plants per 10-20 tray, so it's our lowest density growing technique. It's important to note that one of our general goals is to minimize the amount of gear that we're trying to use, and that's why we really only use 3 different pot sizes. There's lots of different insert sizes and pot sizes out there that you can use, but one of our goals, because we grow in a cold climate, is that our gear all breaks down to a very small size and then we can store it easily over the winter. So minimizing that gear and that complexity is really an important goal for us. One of the things we like to say is that we're not a commercial greenhouse and we can lean into being a small individual grower. We don't have to optimize equipment cost as heavily against plant quality as commercial greenhouses do. So if giving our plants a little bit more soil benefits them, we're going to do that. If it reduces our labor and watering requirements, then we're also going to do that. It's also important to recognize that we can reuse our gear year after year after year, and so that initial equipment cost may be the same as a commercial greenhouse, but over the long term, it's much, much lower for the small independent grower. We talked about when we do our initial transplant in our previous Growing from Seed video, but now we're going to go through the actual mechanics of it. So we use a small eyeglass screwdriver to release the plug from our seeding tray, and then we take that plug and we poke a little hole into the next container size's soil, and we insert that plug. After we insert the plug, we go ahead and water the plant in once we've transplanted everything into that particular tray. One of the most important things in the transplanting process is that we only bring a single plant forward into the next size container. Sometimes multiple seeds will germinate if we inadvertently put more than one seed into our seeding tray, and in that case you can either separate them or clip off any additional plants that might have germinated. But it's really important to reduce competition for those plants once they start growing larger. Some plants like mint, lobelia, and livingstone daisy do prefer to be clustered, but those are generally much less common to run into, and so the one plant per spot goal is generally a good target to try to get to. As we go about our transplanting, it's really important for us to label our plants as we go along so nothing gets mixed up. A lot of different plant varieties, as well as even different plant types like brassicas, can really look alike in the early growth stages, and it's difficult to tell them apart. So that labeling is really important. As we go about our transplanting, inevitably we're going to need more space. Those cute little seedlings that we were germinating eventually turn into full-blown plants. And it's important not to underestimate how quickly this process happens and how much overall space you're going to need, especially when you're growing indoors. It can be difficult to deal with that, and so we're going to talk about what we do. This inevitable expansion is one of the biggest reasons why we use temporary growing tables in our indoor growing process. And basically what these are 2-foot by 6-foot tables that have a little PVC light hanger above them, and we hang quantum board LEDs above them for our grow lighting. And we can set up as many of these as we need and have space for, but this allows us to deal with that expansion very, very easily and in a temporary way. And we'll tell you, yes, indoor growing is a little bit invasive into our lifestyle. It takes up our indoor growing space. Fortunately, both of us are heavy proponents of growing, and it's an important goal for both of us. And so we don't have a lot of internal conflict in our family to be able to do this. But one of our general goals is to try to get our plants out into our greenhouse as soon as we possibly can. Because it is still invasive for us, we'd prefer that our plants be outside. So after we do the initial transplant, this is also when we shift our watering techniques. So we go from top watering our plants to bottom watering. And basically with bottom watering, what we're doing is we're adding water into our 10-20 trays, and what happens is the water will wick into the soil. And the biggest reasons we do this is that it ensures a very thorough watering, and also since we have a lot of trays going on at this point in time, it heavily reduces our watering and labor requirements. Bottom watering is a fantastic watering technique because fundamentally it will prevent overwatering your plants. It is important that if you have additional water left in your tray after about 30 minutes or so, that you remove that excess water. We don't want to drown our plants. But bottom watering generally is going to save you a whole lot of time, and we even use it on our houseplants and things like that. It's really important for us to consider fertilizing our plants at a certain point, and we start to look at this about a week or two after our initial transplant or sometime between when the plant gets its first and second set of true leaves. And we really like using a water-soluble fertilizer for this process, and generally speaking, a good water-soluble all-purpose fertilizer is going to be a good bet early in the season like this. As for fertilizer dosage, this is going to differ depending on the manufacturer. If your fertilizer has a seedling dosage, that's generally the advice that we would recommend following. But a lot of fertilizers don't have a seedling dosage, and so a general guideline that you can use is to use about 1/8 to 1/4 of a normal dose. So for example, if it says 1 teaspoon per gallon, you would use a 1/4 teaspoon gallon or maybe 1/8 of a teaspoon per gallon. And generally speaking, we follow the manufacturer's timing guidelines, which for most water-soluble fertilizers is going to be between every 7 to 10 days. And just like with our watering techniques, we use bottom watering in order to get that fertilizer into our plants. So we just add the water to our tray, just like we talked with the bottom watering technique. Some gardeners may want to fertigate every time that they water their plants, and that certainly does make things easier to remember. And if you're doing this, it's important to know that you need to reduce that dosage even further. So sometimes you might look at 1/8 of a dose or 1/16 of a dose, or sometimes even smaller. And this is going to heavily depend on your fertilizer manufacturer. And generally speaking, there's not usually good guidance on the fertilizer to be able to do this. So it's a little bit of trial and error that you have to figure out. So now we're going to talk about hardening off, and we do have a more detailed video guide on this process, but we're going to briefly cover it here. And basically hardening off is the process of gently acclimatizing our plants from our indoor grow lights to the power of the sun. And it's really important to do this over a number of days and gently and incrementally introduce that power of the sun to our plants. The timing of when you do this is going to generally depend on what kind of grower you are. For some gardeners, you're going to want to harden off generally about 2 to 3 weeks before your last frost. But for us, we might look at it anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks before our last frost because we have a heated greenhouse that we can move our plants into. So that timing might depend on what your general goals are. And in general, we're looking for days that are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit to harden off our cold tolerant, frost tolerant, and frost sensitive vegetables. And for our warm loving vegetables, we're really exclusively looking for days that are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We do our hardening off process over a period of 5 days, and this is the very fastest that we've been able to do it. And in general, what we use is 1 day at 1 hour, 2 days at 2 hours, 1 day at 4 hours, and 1 day at 8 hours. And then after that, our plants are sufficiently hardened off to be outside. If you're going to improve this process, what we would generally recommend is more days at lower amounts of time. So for example, maybe 2 days at 1 hour or 3 days at 2 hours. It's really important to know that it's those first few days that are the most important and that it's a low amount of time. And it really doesn't matter if you harden off under the bright sun or under a cloudy day or under a tree or anything like that. If you follow that short period of time up front, then it's going to work well for you. So we mentioned earlier that sometimes we do end up uppotting our plants into 5.5-inch pots. And we typically only do this for our largest and fast-growing plants like tomatoes, peppers, and artichokes. And we do this largely to reduce our labor requirements. Because we're just growing on our own and we have full-time jobs, it's really important that we don't have to water every few hours or even once a day. And so having more soil helps us to reduce our watering demand and thus put less labor into our plant-raising process. In the subarctic, this has also saved our bacon on our garden a lot of years. Some years we have exceptionally late frost, like last year where it snowed on June 4th. And so having plants in those larger containers definitely can reduce the amount of stress if you're going into one of those seasons where you can't put your plants outside super early in the season, and having more soil allows those plants to continue to grow. Some of you might logically ask why we don't just transplant into the larger containers to begin with. And really what it is about is preserving our indoor growing space. It's really important, especially early in the season, to reduce the pressures on our indoor growing space since we have so many plants that we're developing. But later in the season, we've shifted a lot of our plants out into our greenhouse, and therefore we have a lot more space indoors that we can grow under grow lights, and thus we can consider uppotting those larger vegetables. When it comes to this uppotting process, for tomatoes and peppers, we use a practice called burying the stem. And basically, this is the practice where when you're uppotting, you bury the plant further down into the soil and you actually cover the bottom portion of the stem with soil. And what will happen is the plant will actually produce roots out of that stem, and it can improve greatly the actual root structure of the plant. And it also helps you so that you don't get unwieldy large plants early in the season. We are fortunate to have a semi-heated greenhouse, and we're going to talk about both using this as well as using the outdoors. But generally speaking, we can heat our greenhouse to a minimum temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and what this allows us to do is virtually guarantee that we are not going to have frost in our greenhouse. And so we can use this as a transition point for our seedlings and not necessarily have to be concerned about the risks of frost killing our plants. It's really important to know that not all greenhouses can support heating efforts. One of the really important things that we've done is insulated our greenhouse, and that allows us to heat it relatively efficiently against cooler outdoor temperatures. But if you don't have airtightness in your greenhouse, one of the things that can happen is all that heat that you put in is just going to escape and you end up heating the outdoors, and it can end up costing you a lot of money. So if this is your case, we generally recommend following our outdoor advice, which we're going to give a little bit later, because you can still get frost develop in a greenhouse if it's not insulated. We always start with moving our most cold hardy plants out into our greenhouse, so things like onions and celery, things that are frost tolerant or very cold hardy. And the reason is that especially early in the season, we're dealing with relatively cool temperatures of like 40 degrees in our greenhouse. If you end up moving warmer loving plants like tomatoes and peppers out that early, you can end up damaging those plants for life. And so it's really important to know your plant cold temperature tolerance and decide to shift things outdoors or into the greenhouse based on those tolerance levels. So with those warm-loving vegetables like peppers especially, we generally want temperatures that are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit before we're going to risk putting them outside or into our greenhouse. And we really need to be able to guarantee those temperatures. And we generally speaking don't want to heat our greenhouse to those levels. And so for the most part, we just wait until our last frost or sometime after our last frost to get those guys outside. It's important to know that you can use a very similar strategy to what we're using our greenhouse for, just getting your plants outside. But with this process, it's really important to know the temperature tolerance of your various plants and that you observe low minimum temperatures, typically overnight, and not stress those plants with lower temperatures than what they can survive at. But this is a technique that you can use to get your plants outside much earlier in the season, and typically you can look at this between 2 and 4 weeks before your actual last frost. We do have a very detailed article on plant temperature tolerance that you'll find linked down in the video's description, and you might want to check that out if this is something interesting to you. So at a certain point, we've raised our plants and they are sufficient to be planted into the garden. One of the steps we do often take is moving our plants briefly outside before we transplant them into the garden, just to allow them to experience the full outdoor experience and that they're ready to be planted into our garden. So just like with some of the processes we were talking about earlier, we generally create a strategy for planting into our garden. So about 2 weeks to last frost, we're going to be planting our cold hardy and frost tolerant vegetables into our garden, but we do wait on those frost sensitive and warm loving plants. And generally speaking, we want to wait until at least our last frost, and sometimes a little bit later depending on the season, in order to plant those. And really what we want to make sure of is that those frosts cannot happen, and with warm loving vegetables that they're not going to experience temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So we use a very similar strategy for our planting as well. A really good process to use in cold climates is when you get to 2 weeks to last frost to really look at those 10-day forecasts and determine what you're going to be looking at for the next 10 days. In general, we never recommend planting into adverse conditions like snowfall, ice, or even cold temperatures, but if the 10-day forecast looks really good, then you can go ahead with that planting strategy, and in most seasons you're going to be fine. We can't stress enough to really wait on those warm-loving and frost-sensitive plants, because late frosts can happen in cold climates, and if you have your plants outside, it's going to be game over for those plants. And that's where we're going to end this video. We hope that you found it helpful and to understand our full from seed growing process. There's lots of different ways to go about this, but this is simply how we do it, and we hope that it gives you a good reference. As always, we thank you for watching, and if you made it to this point, we really appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.